Parked in the dark. Looking pretty suspicious, don't you think?
I'm heading home, officer. Hands are right here.
Yeah, why so nervous, huh? Step out for me.
I'm not nervous. Just let me go home.
Door's locked. What are you hiding in there?
Watch it, rookie. Call your shift supervisor now.
Bodycam footage captures flashing lights just after 12:17 a.m. on April 14th, 2019, along Harrison Avenue in Chicago. A calm black driver, Marcus Vance, a 46-year-old senior law enforcement commander, sits in his vehicle following instructions as a rookie officer escalates an encounter that did not require it. Questions turn into commands, and assumptions replace procedure. By the time backup is requested, the power dynamic has already shifted, setting in motion a response that would end one career and quietly affirm another. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The officer on scene is Tyler Reed, 24, fresh out of the academy and still within his first year on patrol. His approach is fast and rigid. He keeps his flashlight trained on the driver's hands longer than necessary, angles his body square to the door, and speaks before fully stopping. Reed wants a clean stop, something he can justify later, because he believes decisiveness looks like authority. He believes hesitation looks weak. Commanding engine off, keys on the dash. The driver complies without comment, but Reed doesn't acknowledge it. The man is Marcus Vance, who is not new to traffic stops. He is a commander with more than 2 decades in law enforcement. He is known inside his department for internal discipline reviews and field training standards. He has supervised patrol units, written policy memos, and signed off on corrective actions. He understands how these encounters unfold when an officer decides early that the stop must justify itself. Window all the way down, Reed says, and the window lowers. Reed leans in, slightly scanning the interior, the back seat, and the floorboard. His questions come clipped and stacked, asking why Vance is parked here this late, who owns the vehicle, and where he is coming from. Marcus Vance answers each one plainly. He keeps his hands visible, resting on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. He doesn't ask why he was stopped. He doesn't challenge the tone, and he simply waits for the next instruction. Reed circles once eyes on the tires, the plates, and the trunk seam before coming back sharper. "You got any weapons in the car?" he asks, to which Vance replies, "No, sir." When asked if he has anything illegal, Vance again says, "No, sir." Reed pauses, then asks again, slower and louder, as if repetition might change the answer, but it doesn't. Keeping his voice neutral, Vance asks, "Am I being detained, officer?" Reed doesn't answer the question, and instead asks for license and registration. Vance provides both, moving deliberately before each motion. "I'm reaching for my wallet now," Vance says. Reed nods, once eyes fixed, then steps back to the cruiser. The body cam records radio chatter as Reed runs the information, but no alerts or warrants appear. The return comes back clean. Reed doesn't end the stop. He returns with a different posture. Shoulders higher, chin up, and demands Vance step out of the vehicle. Vance looks forward and asks, "For what reason, officer?" Reed tightens his jaw and replies, "I'm asking you to step out." Vance opens the door and steps onto the pavement, standing straight with feet shoulder-width apart and hands visible. Reed positions him near the front of the cruiser and tells him to turn around. Vance complies, but Reed doesn't cuff him. He pats him down quickly and unnecessarily firmly. When he's done, he doesn't say the stop is over. He keeps talking. "What do you do for work?" Reed asks. "I'm in law enforcement," Vance replies. "Where?" Reed questions. "I'm a commander," with Vance begins, but Reed cuts him off. "I didn't ask for your rank," Reed says, and Vance stops speaking. Reed steps away and calls for backup. His radio tone is controlled, but the request is unnecessary, given the circumstances, though he frames it as officer safety. "Back up to my location," he says. Vance waits with his eyes forward while traffic passes intermittently and a bus rumbles by, but the street stays mostly quiet. Reed fills the time with more questions, circling back to earlier answers and probing for inconsistencies that don't appear. Each time Vance answers, Reed reframes the question, asking if he's sure or demanding a yes or no answer. Vance stays measured, replying with "yes, sir" or "no, sir" as minutes pass and the sound of another cruiser approaches. Reed straightens again, glancing toward the street, and Vance notices the shift, but remains still. Headlights wash over the scene as the second unit pulls in behind Reed's car. The backup officer steps out and pauses, taking in the positioning of the driver standing free. With no cuffs, no citation in hand, and no clear cause, the backup officer looks at Vance first, then at Reed. "What's the situation?" the backup officer asks. Reed starts to answer while Vance says nothing. The body cam records the moment before anything changes, the pause, the assessment, and the recognition that follows. The backup officer pulls in behind Reed's cruiser and steps out slowly. His name is Sergeant Michael Hayes. 41, a field supervisor with nearly 2 decades on patrol and night watch command experience. He doesn't rush, having handled enough stops to know when something is off before a word is spoken. Hayes pauses at the edge of the headlights, letting his eyes move without urgency. He notes the position of the vehicles, the lack of restraints, and the absence of paperwork in Reed's hands. He looks at Marcus Vance again, this time longer. Vance stands still, posture relaxed, but formal hands, visible eyes forward. "What's going on?" Hayes asks. Reed answers quickly, claiming it's a suspicious vehicle, and the driver was uncooperative. Vance turns his head slightly and says, "I've complied with every instruction." Reed reacts immediately, snapping, "I didn't give you permission to speak." Hayes raises a hand, subtle but firm, and says, "It's fine. Let him talk." Vance keeps his voice, even stating that he was parked, was asked to step out, and did so, but there has been no explanation beyond that. Hayes nods once. He looks back at Reed and asks what the violation is. Reed hesitates before saying he was parked in a high-crime area after midnight. "That's not a violation," Hayes says. Reed shifts his weight and insists he's still investigating. Hayes glances at the patrol car, then back to Vance, asking, "Sir, do you have identification on you?" Vance reaches slowly into his jacket pocket and says, "I do. I'm going to hand it to you." He produces his credentials and extends them without stepping forward. Hayes takes them, looks down briefly, then looks back up at Vance's face. His expression changes not dramatically, but enough to register, and he checks the credentials again more carefully before straightening up. Reed notices and asks, "What is it?" Hayes doesn't answer right away, but hands the credentials back to Vance with both hands. "Yes, sir," Hayes says, and the word lands differently than anything spoken so far. Reed frowns and repeats, "Sir." Hayes turns slightly toward Reed and says, "This is Commander Marcus Vance." Reed blinks and asks, "Commander of what?" Before Vance answers himself, Regional Operations. There is a brief silence as traffic passes and the cruiser lights continue flashing. Reed lets out a short, dismissive laugh and says, "That doesn't change anything." Hayes' voice stays level as he replies, "It does." Reed's tone sharpens, stating he's running the stop. Hayes looks at Reed directly now and says, "No, you're not," gesturing toward Vance. "You requested backup for officer safety. I'm here. I'm assessing," Hayes continues. Reed opens his mouth to respond, then closes it, looking back at Vance, then at Hayes, while Vance remains quiet. Hayes asks Vance, "Commander, were you informed of the reason for the stop?" "No," Vance says. "Were you cited for anything?" Hayes asks. "No," Vance replies. "Were you told you were under arrest?" Hayes continues. "No," Vance answers, and Hayes nods again. Hayes turns to Reed and asks, "Why is he still here?" Reed's answer comes slower this time, as he claims he was just making sure. Making sure of what, Hayes asks, but Reed doesn't answer. Hayes exhales in a controlled manner. "You don't detain someone to make sure when there's no cause," Hayes states. Reed's shoulders tense as he argues that Vance challenged his authority. Vance speaks calmly, "I asked if I was being detained." Hayes looks at Reed and points out, "That's not a challenge." Reed looks away, his jaw tight, as Hayes steps half a pace toward him, lowering his voice but maintaining his firmness. "You need to end this," Hayes says. Reed shakes his head and says, "Not yet," to which Hayes straightens and demands, "Yes, now." Reed turns toward his cruiser, then back again, as if weighing his options. He keys his radio, then stops himself, looking uncertain for the first time since the stop began. Hayes addresses Vance again. "Commander, you're not being detained. You're free to go." Vance nods, says understood, and as he turns toward his car, Reed steps forward and says, "Hold on." Hayes reacts immediately, declaring, "That's enough," causing Reed to freeze. Hayes steps between them, positioning his body deliberately, and tells Reed, "You've already overstepped." Reed's voice rises as he accuses Hayes of taking Vance's side. Hayes responds without hesitation, "I'm following procedure." Vance opens his car door and pauses, looking back briefly at Hayes to say, "Thank you." "Yes, sir," Hayes replies. Vance gets into his car, closes the door, starts the engine signals, and pulls away, smoothly disappearing down Harrison Avenue. Hayes watches until the car is out of sight, then turns fully toward Reed and asks, "What was that?" Reed shrugs defensively, claiming he was doing his job. Hayes shakes his head and says, "No, you weren't." He gestures toward the cruiser camera, noting that everything Reed did is on record. Reed scoffs, So So this becomes a problem for you, Hayes replies. Reed crosses his arms and insists Vance shouldn't get special treatment. Hayes responds without hesitation. He got the treatment he should have had from the start. Reed looks away again, breathing faster now. Hayes keys his radio and calls, "Supervisor to my location." Reed's head snaps back as he asks why. "Because this doesn't end here," Hayes states. They stand under the flashing lights in silence, waiting, while somewhere else in the city, a commander makes a phone call. The supervisor arrives without urgency, parking behind the two cruisers and stepping out into the spill of red and blue lights. He doesn't speak immediately. He watches and takes in Reed's stance, Hayes' position, and the empty stretch of roadway where Vance's car disappeared minutes earlier. "Who called it in?" the supervisor asks. Hayes answers that he did. Reed shifts and says he had it under control. The supervisor looks at Reed, but doesn't respond, then asks what happened. Hayes keeps it brief and factual, outlining the stop from the moment he arrived, with no commentary or tone, just the sequence of events. When he finishes, the supervisor nods once and asks if the body cams were running the entire time. "Yes," Hayes says, confirming both units were recording. The supervisor turns to Reed and asks, "At any point did you reconsider the stop?" Reed hesitates and mentions suspicious activity, to which the supervisor replies that it isn't a violation. Reed opens his mouth, then closes it, looking past the supervisor with a tight jaw. The supervisor glances at Hayes and asks, "You recognized him?" "Yes, sir," Hayes confirms. The supervisor nods again and says he knows the name. Reed looks up sharply and asks, "You do?" The supervisor finally faces him fully and says yes, and that's not the point. He gestures toward the roadway and explains that whether Reed knew who he was or not, the stop didn't meet the threshold. Reed exhales hard and asks, "So what, I'm just supposed to let people sit wherever they want?" "You're supposed to articulate cause." The supervisor says you're supposed to de-escalate when there is none. Reed looks down, then back up, complaining that Vance talked back. The supervisor doesn't raise his voice as he corrects him, stating that Vance asked a legal question. There's a pause before the supervisor turns, slightly angling his body away from Reed. He keys his radio and requests a unit number and timestamp, then stops and looks at Hayes. "Walk me through the credential moment," he requests. Hayes explains how Vance handed over his identification, how he confirmed it, and how the information aligned with what he already knew. The supervisor listens, nodding, and when Hayes finishes, he looks back at Reed. "At any point," the supervisor asks, "did you reconsider the stop?" Reed doesn't answer. "At any point," the supervisor repeats, "did you think you might be wrong?" Reed swallows and admits, "I didn't want to look weak." The supervisor lets the words sit before saying, "Authority isn't about looking strong. It's about knowing when you don't have it." He gestures toward the cruiser and tells Reed to sit tight. Reed stiffens and asks, "Am I being suspended?" "Not right now. Right now you're being removed from patrol," the supervisor answers. Reed's shoulders sag slightly as he walks toward the car, opens the door, and sits staring forward. The supervisor turns to Hayes, stating he'll handle the paperwork and needs his report by the end of the shift. "Yes, sir," Hayes says. The supervisor nods once more, steps back toward his vehicle, pauses and looks at Hayes to say, "You did the right thing." Hayes nods but doesn't respond as the supervisor drives off. The lights fade and the street returns to quiet. Hayes remains standing beside his cruiser for a moment, then reaches up and turns off his own lights. He leans against the hood, exhales, and looks down the road where Vance disappeared. Several miles away, Marcus Vance pulls into a quiet side street and parks. He sits in the car for a moment before reaching for his phone to make one call. He doesn't raise his voice or describe feelings. He describes actions. "I was stopped. No citation, no cause. Backup arrived. Supervisor was called. He reports." There's a pause as he listens, then he says, "Yes, I'll document it in the morning." He ends the call and sits for another moment before driving on. Back on Harrison Avenue, Hayes finishes his notes, typing slowly and deliberately sticking to what he observed. When he's done, he signs the report and submits it. As he closes the laptop, a thought crosses his mind, not about the stop, but about what came next, the gesture that would later be referenced in internal briefings and training discussions. When Hayes first returned Vance's credentials before the supervisor arrived, and before Reed realized what was happening, Hayes had done something small but deliberate. He had straightened his posture and brought his hand up, fingers aligned, palm angled, correctly. It wasn't for show or for the camera. It was a salute, not because of rank alone, but because of recognition of conduct restraint and command presence under pressure. No one spoke about it at the time, and Reed didn't understand what he was seeing. The moment passed quickly, almost unnoticed, but the footage would capture it clearly. And later, in a review room, paused and replayed. Frame by frame, that single gesture would become the clearest dividing line in the entire incident. One officer escalated to prove himself, while another recognized authority and stopped it, and the consequences were already in motion. The review begins 3 days later in a small conference room at headquarters. No press, no announcements, just a supervisor, internal affairs, and a monitor playing bodycam footage from multiple angles. The room stays quiet as the stop unfolds, exactly as it happened, with no narration or commentary, only timestamps and audio. The questions come after why was the stop initiated, what violation was articulated, why was the driver removed from the vehicle, and why was backup requested. Reed answers carefully, at first referring to training and referencing officer safety. When pressed, his explanations narrow, and he repeats phrases already captured on camera. Each time the footage contradicts him, the room pauses, rewinds, and plays it again. At no point does the discussion focus on Marcus Vance's rank. That detail is intentionally removed from the analysis. The reviewers focus on conduct tone, escalation, and decision points, noting the missed opportunities to end the stop. They highlight the moment Reed dismisses a lawful question as challenging authority and mark the radio call for backup as unjustified. By the end of the session, the outcome is clear. Reed is placed on administrative leave pending termination, and his probationary status shortens the process. There is no arbitration, no drawn-out appeal, and the paperwork moves quickly. 2 weeks later, Reed resigns. The department releases a short internal memo that avoids names but emphasizes training standards and procedural compliance. Mandatory refresher sessions are scheduled for patrol units, using anonymized footage from the incident. The salute is shown during those sessions, paused and replayed, not as symbolism, but as instruction. Sergeant Michael Hayes continues his normal assignment and is asked to assist with training for new officers, not as discipline, but as an example. He doesn't speak publicly about the stop, but when asked privately, he keeps it simple. It was a bad stop, and it didn't need to go that far. Marcus Vance files his report the morning after the incident. It's factual, timed, and detailed. He doesn't request disciplinary action or contact the media. He submits the report through official channels and moves on. Weeks later, he's asked to sit in on a policy discussion regarding nighttime patrol discretion. He listens more than he speaks, and when he does speak, it's measured. Authority, he says, shows up in restraint. The incident never makes headlines, but inside the department, it circulates quietly, shared in briefings, referenced in training, and cited during evaluations. Officers talk about it without naming it, saying, "Remember that Harrison Avenue stop and everyone knows." One officer tried to assert control without cause, and another recognized command without being told. And a system briefly exposed corrected itself the only way it knows on record, on camera, and without applause.